much next to the music. When you're in a big band and there's not a whole lot of ways to express yourself.
You weren't doing any soloing in that band, or wasn't much of that?
No, and you're starting to think, gee, a small group. Be nice to be in a small group and be able to do the jazz literature. So big bands. Ever since that period, I've had very little to do with big bands. Of course, at the time, trombone. I mean, you're able to contribute in some way, but then when I switched to the piano, I thought to myself, well, this is the basis of everything. The piano is everything. You have everything you need.
So when and how did you switch to the piano?
Through a process of working, and if I could get a job on trombone, I would do that. If things thinned out, like I say, for a period of time, I was playing vibraphone. That worked out a little bit, but circumstances and trying to have some kind of activity going, switching to piano was a pretty good was a pretty good thing to do, because you were more in demand. You could go out and work alone on piano. Mm-hmm. So you were able, the work there was more work available on piano.
So this was after you left the Navy, and where were you based? I mean, yourself, where was your home after you left the Navy?
For all practical purposes, I left my hometown in my mid-20s and never went back.
Okay, so you were in the Navy, and you would go back to Lewistown as a home?
I went back to Lewistown for a brief period of time, but then when I started traveling with big bands, then I never went back. Mm-hmm. I never went back home.
Mm-hmm. So in the process of leaving the big bands, you started playing as a piano player, you said, I think.
Eventually, yeah.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. Eventually everything led to the piano.
How did you start playing piano in public? What were your first gigs or performances as a pianist?
Well, anything. A country club situation, or maybe a brunch where you play background music. Mm-hmm. You take anything that would give you contact with the piano, mm-hmm. and eventually you catch somebody's ear, and there again you start networking, mm-hmm. and pretty soon.
So when you were in those days after you left your hometown, where were you living? Where did you move to?
I moved back to New York because by then I had known a little bit about the city. Having, there again, like I say, having been in Brooklyn all that period of time, I wanted to be in New York.
Mm-hmm. So you played in New York for a while?
I didn't have a lot of activity in New York. I traveled out of New York. If I traveled with the big bands, it was out of New York. Mm-hmm. And then I would go back, and there would be periods of time. And then for a variety of reasons, I started making my way out west here. It's a long, complicated story. Uh-huh. But I had stopovers in Denver and Tulsa.
When you were touring?
I was we were just I was married at the time. My wife Dolores and I were traveling light, and we were able to go pretty much wherever we wanted to. Mm-hmm. My idea was to see as many places and hear as many people as I could. Mm-hmm. And that's what we did.
You did that after you left the big bands?
After we left the big bands, after we left New York City.
You just traveled and followed music here and there? And
we left New York City and started west, and it was the scariest thing I've ever done in my life. New York was so nice and safe. It was a community, and here we are out west, the wide open spaces. What is more frightening than that? You know what I mean?
Well, so you would just show up in a town and start going around listening to musicians, or how did this work?
I was invited to come to Tulsa first by a friend.
Why did he invite you?
Because we had met each other in New York City, And he had been here, and he invited me out here, so I came out to look around, and we stayed for a little while. It was just great, but our intention was not to stay, and we moved on. We moved to Denver, and I did pretty much the same thing up there, and networked with the local musicians all the time, trying to hear things and trying to see as many people and hear as many people as you can.
And at that time, you were doing primarily piano?
Primarily piano.
Mm-hmm.
Not exclusively, but primarily, I would say.
How long did you travel like that and go to different places?
Couple of years.
Wow.
Couple of years. And then things started happening in Tulsa again, and I was invited back.
By your friend? Or
by a variety of people.
Yeah.
I'm trying to simplify a complicated story.
Yeah. But you became known in Tulsa from having spent time here and played here, and then people wanted you to come back and become part of the music.
Well, I wouldn't say that. Some people wanted me to come back. A lot of other people wanted me to stay away. So.
But enough wanted you to come that you came back.
I guess so. I would.
So what kind of things did you play? You moved here, I guess, semi-permanently at some point then?
We moved to Tulsa. We came back to Tulsa, and eventually,
Do you know what year that was when you moved here more or less permanently?
You're asking for these years, aren't you? Okay.
Or how old were you? Do you remember?
I was in my mid to late 20s when we came back to Tulsa.
Okay.
Permanently.
Mm-hmm.
And if a seed stays in the soil long enough, it's going to, pretty soon we had a family. Mm-hmm. And so Tulsa became our home.
Okay, what did you start playing when you moved to Tulsa? What kinds of things did you play? Where did you play them?
For a while, I was fortunate enough to play jazz exclusively, and I was playing vibraphone a lot.
You've taught yourself vibraphone also? Just by listening to people?
I did.
Mm-hmm.
I played a little vibraphone in the Navy, as a matter of fact.
So when you came here, you played jazz almost exclusively, you said, for a while. For
quite a long period of time, I was able to do that, and just about every night in the week.
What kinds of places were you playing?
Well, I worked in Tulsa. There was a jazz club called the Rubaiyat, which a lot of people will probably remember. Even today, it was a unique place.
Where was that located?
It was located on South Peoria here in Tulsa, the 6700 block, South Peoria.
And what was noteworthy about that place?
It was one of the better jazz clubs I think I'd ever seen.
And you'd seen a lot.
Well, I think so.
What was so good about it?
It was built for musicians. It was built for jazz. It was built from the ground up. Sonny Gray was the leader and the shaker and the mover. And it was his idea to have a club exclusively for jazz. And everything that went into that building was with jazz performance in mind.
Now, what would that mean in terms of the building?
That meant that the design inside was it was like a little small coliseum with a stage, and the sound facilities and recording facilities were the best.
This was kind of like a small concert hall almost.
You might call it that. You might call it that, but really it was closer to a supper club.
Okay, so people were eating and drinking. They had tables, but you said set up like a coliseum. You said.
Well, like a little theater. Maybe. It was built on 2 levels. And some other nationally known musicians would come there and work, and they had nothing but good things to say about it. It was a unique place as far as jazz music was concerned.
The Rubaiyat.
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 The Rubaiyat.
Do you have any idea of when that place opened, roughly?
It was in the early 60s.
Early 60s. How long did it stay open, do you think?
Several years. Several years.
Only a few, till mid-60s or late 60s?
Probably mid-60s, a little later than that, yeah.
Was it, do you think it was just because it was too hard to make a go financially for that place, or?
Things change. Finances are one thing. Music changes. I don't know.
But you played there a lot, you said.
We played every night of the week for several years.
You played piano and vibraphone?
I played vibraphone exclusively on that job, yeah.
Were you playing in a single band or with multiple different groups?
I was playing in Sonny's band. This was the Sonny Gray Quartet. He was like I say, he was the brains. He was the thing behind it all. I was a hired hand.
Mm-hmm. You were playing vibraphone?
Vibraphone, yes, sir.
Okay. You played there for several years every night?
Sure
every
did.
night.
Yeah.
Was I guess you could make a living at that. You could manage. You didn't have to do anything else. You could make a living just playing.
I wasn't doing anything else at the time, and I didn't need a lot of money at the time. But yes, under the right circumstances, if things fell right, yes, you could make a living.
Mm-hmm. And so you were able to do that for several years.
I was able to do that for several years.
Every night. Playing jazz.
Absolutely.
And when that dried up, what happened then?
Well, then you do what you can, and you become acquainted with contractors, and they have jobs for you. And I would run into other jazz situations along the way, but after a while, I mean, you would never see that type of activity. I mean, you don't see that type of activity today.
That was kind of a special time in the early 60s?
It was kind of a special time. I think so. Yeah, I really do.
And even shortly thereafter, you say it changed quite a lot. There wasn't as much of that kind of work.
Yeah, it changed. As far as we're talking as far as jazz music is concerned, it changed. Now you could you could get a lot of activity, and I've been lucky enough to have my share of activity around Tulsa. Because there are other venues, other things to do, but some of us who like jazz, we're always looking for the opportunity to play jazz, and we run into these opportunities once in a while, but never on a steady basis like it used to be.
And when you say steady basis, you mean that every night thing?
Yeah, going out every night, working a club, and selling the music, playing for the public.
Well, were there other places in addition to the Rubaiyat that were doing jazz full time?
There were. I think because of the Rubaiyat, I think it encouraged other people to open some venues. So yes, there were some other pretty good jazz groups around at the time. Yeah.
Groups, you meaning groups of musicians?
Groups of music, jazz groups.
Do you remember any of them?
I don't remember a lot. If I started naming names, I'm going to miss somebody.
Right.
And
do you remember any of the clubs that would also play jazz at that time?
There you go again.
There are a number of them, yeah.
There were a number of them. Everything was it was just a period of a lot of activity. Yeah.
Once, and that activity, you would say, dissipated in the later 60s, began to disappear at that time, or
things change.
Scaled back?
Yeah, things change. Music changes, and a new audience comes along. You get a younger audience who I remember in the mid '60s is when the Beatles had quite a bit of influence, and some of the rock bands had their own built-in audiences. I mean, they would. The new generation comes along, and jazz and our type of music loses quite a bit of our audience.
So what did you play then? What did you do when that began to happen?
Tulsa's kind of unique in that there were always some things that a musician could do. You would have hotel jobs, or you could play private parties, and some of the contractors would hook up with bands to do a little bit at a club here or a club there, or you got to know club owners. You know, you would know them and they would know you, and if you get in the mix, so to say, you can be pretty busy. And I was for a long time I was in the mix and was able to be, you know, fairly active over a period of time.
So club owners would sometimes have jazz nights. They would have jazz at particular nights. They would invite jazz groups to play, or
We would play jazz as much as we could, and sometimes they would do that if they, you know, they knew that that's the type of music you played. They would take a chance, have you come in for a couple of weeks, maybe, you know, give it a shot, and then they'd bring you back some other time. You know, there was some cohesiveness, a little cooperation between musicians and club owners, which came in awfully handy.
So it sounds like there was still a fair amount of activity.
There was a fair amount of activity in Tulsa.
Mm-hmm.
Probably sometimes more so than in a lot of other cities, because you know, we had these mansions and show places, and people wanted music to be a part of their activity, and the usual weddings and banquets, anything, you know. These are part and parcel the things that a musician does.
And you would play multiple different styles of music for these events?
Exactly. Absolutely. Sure.
Were you playing with in particular bands or with particular people through that whole time, or you would form different ones?
Not in a particular band. You might organize for a short period of time, you know, to do certain activities, but there was not a lot of permanence as far as these bands were concerned at the time.
Were you playing some of that time alone with piano?
Sure.